Today we're at the Center for Western Studies on the campus of Augustana University, which is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's an institution of higher learning that's been in South Dakota for over 100 years. My new book, From Warm Center to Ragged Edge, takes its title from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is the author, probably most famously, of The Great Gatsby. And if you remember your Gatsby from back in high school or college, you'll remember that Nick Carraway was from Minnesota. But Nick Carraway went off to war. This would have been World War I. And when he came back, he decided that he thought it would be sort of dull to move back to Minnesota, which he saw as the ragged edge of the universe. And he decided to move to New York. And he got mixed up in the Roaring '20s on Long Island with Gatsby and all that cast of characters from his book. But in the end, when he sees what happens to many of these characters, he begins to see the old Midwest, where he came from, as the warm center of the world. And so that contrast is what I try and draw out in my new book, From Warm Center to Ragged Edge. In the decades after the Civil War, the Midwest was seen by many commentators as the pace-setter region, the place where literature was the most active, the place where there was the most dynamic economy, the place where political power was growing and would continue to grow. Most of the presidents after the Civil War, 7 of 8, came from the Midwest. They came from places like Ohio and Indiana and Iowa. And the Midwest also, in addition to its political and economic clout, had a great deal of cultural clout. Some of the prominent writers will be forgotten by most listeners, but at the time they were household names. And I'm thinking about people like James Whitcomb Riley of Indiana, whose coffin laid in state in Indianapolis for a week because there were thousands of well-wishers who came through because he was so well known at this period of time. This was part of the Indiana golden age of literature, which featured people like Riley and Booth Tarkington and Lew Wallace, who was the author of Ben-Hur. And there were prominent authors like Sherwood Anderson of Ohio, and Sinclair Lewis of Minnesota, and F. Scott Fitzgerald of St. Paul, who we talked about a little bit ago. All of these people were making a major mark for the Midwest in American literary culture. About midway through the 20th century, you could begin to see the effects of the growing clout and growing power of the coasts in American culture, especially with the movie industry, where by the late 1940s, that was the most predominant form of entertainment in the country. And many Americans went to 3 or 4 or 5 movies a week. And most of those movies were shot in Hollywood and in Los Angeles. And so that showed the power of California and the West Coast at that time. And then soon after that followed television, much of which was produced in Hollywood. And pretty soon, most Americans in the span of a decade had a television set. When the 50s began, 2% of Americans had televisions. By the end of the decade, 90+% of them did. I think you can see the influence of the diminishment of Midwestern regionalism in our politics in the frustration of some people in the middle of the country with other people dominating or controlling the culture. And I think there's a real longing in the interior parts of the country for more of an assertive role in our culture. They want to be more of a part of the production of cultural forms that are prominent in our culture. And I think you see this longing for a real genuine democratic pluralism in the country. People know and can feel when they're being dominated and when they don't have much of a voice. And I think you see those kind of frustrations bubbling up in our politics today. The good news is that there have been some major developments in the past few years that will allow people to rediscover their own regional and cultural history. I think the first step was the formation of the Midwestern History Association, which is a national organization and it meets every year in Michigan, but actually it was founded in Sioux Falls. Well, the Midwestern History Association in particular was founded on the principle that the academic field of Midwestern history had completely collapsed by the mid-1990s or so, and that it was far past time to redevelop the infrastructure of that field. And the critical infrastructure is having an association dedicated to the study of a particular region, an association that meets every year, brings scholars together, gets them on panels, gets them talking about this region, and also creates a space for them to publish their work. Midwesterners begin to dig into their own history. They're going to see very similar stories. And when you hear those stories, you want to know what your ancestors went through and what they lived through and what shaped them and what made them who they are. And that's why people want to rediscover this history of our particular region. One of the complications of reviving the study of the Midwest is that there are many Midwesterners who are very humble, and some of them think that, well, we don't have much of a story to tell, and even if we did, we're not going to boast about it. But I'm trying to shake these Midwesterners out of their complacency and get them to think a little bit more about their region and think a little bit more about their heritage and where they come from. I think the world could certainly stand a few more stronger Midwestern voices out there.